and really about all of my activist work, that, that being part of a long legacy, a historic tradition of people who saw that war was wrong, who saw these terrible injustices in our nation, and did what we could to try and change that.
The Syracuse Peace Council was founded as part of the Emergency Peace Campaign, a nationwide effort that rode a wave of anti-war sentiment based on the horrors of World War I. SPC was one of only 6 such groups to survive World War II. In 1936, SPC sold over $1,500 worth of peace bonds, ranking Syracuse second among all cities nationwide. 21 organizations affiliated, with the mayor of Syracuse and his wife heading the list of 24 individual sponsors. By 1937, SPC produced a weekly radio show, a monthly peace newsletter, the PNL, mailed to some 1,600 people, a monthly discussion bulletin, educational forums, study groups, and 4 standing committees. On December 8, 1941, 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the SPC Executive Committee sent a telegram to Congress urging calm and deliberate consideration. 10 days later, SPC founder Norman Whitney wrote in the Peace Newsletter, "A major objective of our effort through the years has failed. Our beloved country is at war." He continued, during the war, the Peace Council would be ministering to the civilian suffering caused by war, striving to mitigate the interracial hatreds and intolerance such are bound to arise in times of national excitement, and guarding jealously the constitutional, civil, and religious liberties for which America stands. The war years have been devoted almost exclusively to refugees, relief, and the counseling of conscientious objectors, wrote longtime SPC worker Adelaide Webster.
There were a lot of people who were involved in the movement for peace and justice issues, civil rights issues after World War II. We thought we were going to have a wonderful, wonderful world, and yet we didn't have this wonderful, wonderful world. But we kept struggling for it, and there were those of us who kept opposing the wars that this country has been engaged in.
We live in a world that's in desperate straits. We live in a country that's desperately betrayed its own values, and we need to turn that around.
If our government is going around to war every time something happens, then we're telling to the world, or we're telling to our kids also, we're the bully here, and if you're stronger, you can bully anyone.
I want to go back to a photograph that was taken of me at a peace march, anti-war march, actually anti-Korean war march. And I was pregnant with my first child, very, very pregnant. And I had a poster that said, "I want this child to grow up, not blow up."
The growing menace of communism arouses the House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee. Among the well-informed witnesses testifying is J. Edgar Hoover, head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah, this is a dossier sent to me by the FBI, which has about 170 pages to it, and that is offensive and shocking to be regarded as an enemy. And I like to say that, you know, I consider myself such a gentle person. I even cry at basketball games, so it's hard for me to think of myself as some kind of a disloyal enemy, so to speak.
In 1964, the SBC held a 24-hour vigil in downtown Syracuse, ending at noon on Thanksgiving Day. SPC members stood in front of the Christmas tree on Clinton Square. The leaflet they handed out to passers-by read in part, "By the time it takes you to read this leaflet, 35 people will have died from starvation. In the same time, the U.S. will have spent $500,000 for bombs, missiles, and other armaments."
This was during a period where the anti-war movement grew rather rapidly. When were involved with the Peace Council, I remember we had a weekly vigil in downtown on Salina Street. I remember standing there by myself with a sign. And just a few years later, there were 4,000 people standing along the sides of the street. Now, we didn't get 4,000 people out every time.
During the Vietnam War era, anti-war activism nationally and locally intensified. 20 committees, many from various Syracuse neighborhoods, worked with the Peace Council. At the height of activity, the Peace Council employed 5 full-time staff people, and for the first time owned its own office, a small house on Burnett Avenue. In June 1970, the Peace newsletter expanded from a single sheet to its current magazine format. Also during this era, the annual Plowshares Crafts Fair and the annual Peace Calendar, now published by the Syracuse Cultural Workers but originally published by the Peace Council, were initiated.
Culture work really provides the heart and soul and passion in many ways of movement and activist work. It's a gift in a sense that the people who do this work make to changing the world. Culture work also inspires people to continue doing the work or to begin doing work that will change the world.
I remember one march that started from up at the university, came down the hill and into the downtown Syracuse. And I looked back and saw the long line of people. Some of them were carrying candles. And it's something that sticks in my mind as being a fabulous feeling, that there was all of this feelings that by young people, older people, everyone was together on this. It was a very, very good moment.
I was in prison for 2 years, 1967 and 68, for draft resistance.
The year was 1967, Andy, and I recall that very clearly because my brother Phil, and during that year, with 3 other men, invaded a draft board in Baltimore and poured blood on the draft files. And so that turned Carol and me very thoughtful about him. And so we began thinking seriously about peace. And of course, naturally gravitated toward the Peace Council.
While SPC is an independent organization, during the Vietnam War as well as at other times, SPC has worked with many other organizations and considers itself part of a national and international movement for peace and social justice.
There was no part of life that wasn't spoken to with the progressive politics of the Peace Council community. And certainly the 70s was the time of the women's movement, the beginning of the gay liberation, the beginning of the food co-op here in Syracuse. I was a part of that, the beginning of the credit union where we're taking charge of our money.
War and militarism have wide-reaching causes and contributing factors, so that poverty is a peace issue, racism is a peace issue, sexism is a peace issue, environmentalism is a peace issue.
The Peace Council is very simple, very basic idea of a group of people who are going to be, who are adaptable to different circumstances and new crises that come along, and it's a place where you can walk in and say, okay, let's address this problem.
The Peace Newsletter is the Syracuse Peace Council's public voice.
I think that's been its most important function, is to say to the local community and beyond to some extent, here's another way to look at what you're reading about in the daily paper or you're hearing about on the mainstream press. There are other views. Keep in mind that the P&L was serving that function for many, many, many years before there was the internet.
If our social studies teachers were reading the Peace Council newsletter, instead of listening to the very conservative radio stations, I think we would be doing much better work. So I think we have to work harder at ensuring that we broaden our base.